In this module, we're going to be focused on classroom management. Now, the term classroom management is such a broad term, but the gist of it is classroom management is a plan for how you're going to operate your classroom. We are really going to be focused on two aspects of classroom management. We're going to be focused on the procedural aspect, everything from how you're going to get your students started in the morning, how they're going to turn in their work, how are you going to transition from one activity to the next. And then the other aspect of classroom management that we're going to focus on is how you set those rules and expectations at the beginning of the year and how you follow through with them. Now, do know we could spend 16 weeks just on the topic of classroom management. We're basically just skimming the surface. This week, again, we're talking about procedures and rules. Next week is going to be such a fun week. We're going to talk about actually the setting up of your classroom. So what is your classroom visually going to look like? But again, we could spend all 16 weeks on talking about classroom management. So just know we're not going to delve as far into it as you will later on down the road in some of your education courses. With that being said, I wanted to come up with my own personal top 10 suggestions or tips for you for how to implement a great classroom management plan. So, tip number one that I have for you is come up with a plan. So, make sure before you walk into class each and every day, you have a plan for how that class is going to go. I have seen some teachers try to wing it, and winging it does not go well in our profession. So make sure you have a plan and make sure you get organized. So we're going to talk about a lot next week on the setup of your classroom. So what kind of, bins or tubs or folders or journals, what type of things are you going to implement so not only are your students organized, but that you are organized as well. My second tip for you is to set clear expectations. So that's one of the things you're going to be coming up this week in your assignment is what type of expectations do you have of your students? I would encourage you when you are setting up rules and expectations in your classroom is to incorporate your students in developing those rules and expectations, because if you incorporate their opinions, it's really going to make them have more ownership of those rules. My tip number 3 is to be consistent and to establish routines. My students always knew when they walked through the door, this is how my classroom's going to operate. This is what you can expect when you walk in. They can expect what type of activity we're doing. They can expect what type of homework they're going to have. They can expect how we're going to leave the room. This is a lot of what you're coming up with this week is what type of routine are you going to do on a day-to-day basis. Now, I'm not saying you're going to have to do the same lesson every single day, but students should feel safe and comfortable when they walk into your room because they know what type of routine is expected of them. Tip number 4 is address misbehaviors individually. You're going to have students act out in class. It's inevitable. I don't care if you have the best classroom management plan ever. You're still going to have misbehaviors in class, and you just got to learn to accept that. But you've also got to think through, how am I going to address those misbehaviors? Now, my suggestion to you based upon my experience is do not call a student out in the middle of class, because they're either going to, 1, they're going to shut down, or 2, it's even going to make it worse. It kind of fuels their misbehavior when you call them out in front of everybody. I am a big proponent of addressing misbehaviors individually, not in front of other students. So even now at the community college level, if I have interruptions in class, I'm going to take that student outside of the classroom environment and let's have a one-on-one conversation about it. Tip number 5 is find opportunities for praise frequently. And notice I put that in all capital letters. This really goes for your, your high flyer misbehavior students. So your ones that act out a lot, those are the students that you need to find opportunities to praise them, because I can tell you that's what's going to help their behavior flip. I was a big proponent too of, if I have a high flying misbehaving student and they do something well, I'm going to call their parents and let them know about it. Because normally those are the parents who get the phone calls every single day of little Johnny did this and he did that. Well, what happens when little Johnny does something great? Call the parents and let them know. That's going to make a big difference in your class. My 6th tip is to make it fun. So in terms of making sure that your classroom is managed well, you want students to make sure they want to be involved. They want to come to your class. They want to be there because they know they're going to have a good time. If you can ever incorporate games into learning, students are going to be more active. They're not going to misbehave because they want to join in on the fun. Number 7 is to give choices when you can. So I was a big proponent when I was a teacher in 7th grade of doing choice boards as an activity. So that gives students an opportunity of, if they're an artistic student, maybe they can express their learning artistically. If they are students who like to write, maybe they can write a short story. They're still learning. They're still showing you that they have learned, but they feel the ownership of being able to express that the way that they enjoy expressing it. Tip number 8 is don't sweat the small stuff. It took me a very long time as an educator to not sweat the small stuff. I've come a long way since my first year. My first year, every time something went wrong, I thought about it. I mulled over it for days and days and days. You're going to have lessons that don't turn out the way that you envision them. I cannot tell you how many times I've envisioned this awesome activity or this awesome lesson, and then it just crashed and burned. That's going to happen. Things are going to happen. Things are going to go wrong throughout the day, but don't sweat the small stuff. The most important things is, are your students safe? Are your students learning? Have you developed a relationship with those students? If you can answer yes to all those things, then the small stuff does not matter at all. Going kind of along with that, number 9, you have got to take care of yourself as an educator. You can't pour from an empty cup. So education is the one field in which, emotionally, it can be the most rewarding career field, but also emotionally, it can be the most draining career field because those are your kids. Even now, when I'm teaching adults, those are my students. So if something happens, you can go home and it'll just carry home with you. Or another thing with teaching is we go home and we think about our lesson for the next day. We think about all the homework we have to grade. Everything from attendance to parents to students that are experiencing issues at home, it is just constantly going through your brain 24/7. We can't cut off our career. It doesn't mentally cut off for us ever. We've got to carve out opportunities during the day to focus on the other aspects other than just being a teacher. Teaching will consume you. It will become your whole entire personality. It is for me too. But you got to think about those other aspects of your life. Make sure your friends, your family, things that you enjoy outside of teaching, make sure to focus on those too. And then tip number 10, you've heard me say it now, I think, every week thus far in class, you've got to make sure you develop those relationships intentionally with your students. And I use the word intentionally. So you got to make sure that you know your students, not just as a student, but as a whole, as a person. And all the classroom management aspects of procedures, rules, expectations, all of that will fall into place after you've developed those relationships with your students. So let's take a look at your assignments for this week. I broke your reading apart in your textbook into 2 separate areas. So the first set of readings really go over establishing rules and expectations. The second set of reading go over how to establish procedures. This second set of readings, I also go over how to set up a classroom, so how you can organize your classroom. Really, that's going to be next week. So next week, we're going to go over classroom design. But I wanted you to go ahead and read that entire chapter because there are some really good tips for procedural things in there as well. Another thing that I've given you this week, in addition to your textbook, I scoured the internet for different resources on all the things you're going to be addressing in your classroom management plan. So things like attention signals, or what type of routines can you do at the beginning of class, end of class, teaching expectations. You do not have to look at everything in this book. So I wanted to show you even just like class attention signals. I've listed all these different links for you. You don't have to read all of them, but I would encourage you to go through them because the best way we grow as educators is learning from other educators. So most of these are blogs from other educators on tips and tricks. I would encourage you to look through them, start writing down some ideas. So let's go back and talk about your actual assignment for this week, which is going to be your classroom management plan. So what you're doing for your classroom management plan is there are different sections here. The first section are your routines and your procedures. I've given you some examples here for the first 4 just to give you an idea. I do want you to delete these examples and I want you to put your own in there. Feel free if you want to do it as bullet points or if you want to do it as steps like 1, 2, 3, 4. Feel free for however you want to organize this is completely fine. So you're going to have, how do you want to get your class's attention? How do you want to begin class? How do you want to do classroom activities? How do you want to end the class? And then section 2 goes over, what expectations are you going to have for your class and what is that going to look like in your classroom? If you want to add more rows to this table, you certainly can. And then in terms of your teaching expectations, how are you going to teach those expectations at the beginning of the year? How are you going to reteach them throughout the year? Because yes, you are going to need to remind them of the rules and expectations that you've set up. And then how can you incorporate those expectations into your day-to-day instruction? And then the last section are, how are you going to encourage positive behaviors in your class? So you may have a system for individual students. Some teachers incorporate, classroom-wide, positive behavior motivation. So maybe you're going to have some type of reward system in your class. The links that I provided this week, there are some great suggestions on how you can incorporate classroom-wide reinforcements for positive behavior. How are you going to address challenging behavior in your class? And then how are you going to involve parents in increasing positive behavior into your classroom? There's a lot to think about this week. I really hope it gets you excited for, developing a classroom management plan. The last activity that you are going to do for this week is another Note to Future Self journal. So are there going to be some takeaways from this classroom management plan that you develop that you want to make sure that you incorporate into your future classroom? If you have any questions about classroom management or about your assignment for this week, do not hesitate to reach out to me.